Hey everybody, this is Daniel Vitalis from Wild Fed on the Outdoor Channel, and tonight we are premiering season 4 of the show. And I thought as a way of celebrating, I would give you a quick masterclass on how I prepare European mounts. These are just a handful of skulls that I've done myself at home, and I really like the DIY aspect of doing my own mounts. I'm not a huge fan of taxidermies in my house. I do think taxidermies are beautiful, but for me, they're something I like to see more when I go and visit maybe a museum, when I go into a big outfitter. I love to see big, beautiful taxidermies. But in my house, all that hair, I find it's a lot of maintenance, a lot of vacuuming, a lot of cleaning. And I promised my wife when we got married, no taxidermies in the house, but there would be a lot of skulls. So I just love the cleanness of a European mount. Now, the way I do them, I tend to just hang them as is, or I'll put them on a shelf or a countertop. So I'm not gonna be showing how to put a plaque on them or anything like that. That's something you can figure out, but I'm gonna show you how I get a skull quickly down to this kind of clean white level. And I think something that is really exciting about it is how fast it can happen. In fact, many times, and this is gonna sound almost impossible, but it's true, and I'm gonna show you how, many times I'll kill an animal and that night I'll have its skull clean on the wall. That's something you can actually do. So if you've ever sent your animals out to the taxidermist to have them done, you know how long of a wait it can be, and you know it can be expensive. So this is something you can do cheap and easy. Now, there's some downsides, of course, like anything, it has give and take. So the method I'm gonna show you maybe isn't the method you want. Let's say you're trying to score a skull for Boone and Crockett. You know, some people say that you can get a little bit of a kind of shrinkage from that hot water heating the skull up. Let's say you're trying to process something that's maybe a younger animal. Let's say maybe your kid's first harvest. It's not a big trophy animal, but you want to preserve it because it has a memory associated with it. When animals are really young, the boiling water technique I'm going to show you can dissolve a lot of that connective tissue that's holding a young skull together. So, you know, think about when you put a shoulder in the crock pot and all of that connective tissue turns to gelatin and breaks down. If you have a very young skull, you need to be very careful with how much heat, or if you have a very small skull like this turkey or this raccoon, they're gonna need a lot less heat to process them. So those are just little things you wanna consider. I'll show you, for instance, this black bear skull here. Now that's a big Boone and Crockett bear. People were pretty angry at me for processing this myself with water. They wanted me to bring it to the taxidermist where they're gonna use beetles to clean it. Now those carnivorous beetles will get in there and they'll eat away all the tissue, and because you're never exposing it to heat, you don't have to worry about there being very small. Remember, when you're scoring a skull, you know, 1/16 of an inch matters, so you don't want any shrinking to happen. And so if you have a skull like that, maybe you want to use the taxidermist. But if it's something you're going to do at home, you're into taking the risk, I think this is a great method. You can see I've used it for alligator, deer, even shark. This is a swordfish. It works great for a lot of species. Now I'm going to focus in on a skull from season 4 of the show, and that's this right here. This is a Himalayan tar skull. And you can see that I've taken all of the skin, connective tissue, eyeballs. I've even cleaned the brains out of this skull. And this skull got harvested in the making of season 4. You can see that we've lost a bit of the nose here. This animal took a big tumble off a cliff. If you want to see that, you'll have to tune in this season. But I really love this memory. So for me, I'm preserving not a big trophy animal. This is just a sort of a young bull, but the memory for me is really precious, so I want to preserve it. Now, if this animal's skull still had all of the skin, still had eyeballs, was still fully intact, jaw, tongue, all of that, we could do the same method. I was in New Zealand, so I just sat there in the afternoon after our hunt, and I just cleaned all of that off with my knife. If you can, process that in the field. It's a great way to expedite the process. So you can see I really got in there, and you know, you've got a little bit of sort of jerky still on there, but it's mostly clean, and that's going to allow us to do this process really quickly today. One of the most difficult parts is getting the brain out. So this opening at the base of the skull, that's called the foramen magnum. We have one too, and that's how our spinal cord connects in, plugs in to the sort of base of our brain. the brain is surrounded in a sac called the meninges, and that can be really hard to get out. So just know you're gonna need some tools. I often use this little lobster pick. Being a Mainer, we got these things everywhere. Something that you can get in there, pull everything out with. Eyeballs can be a little bit difficult, so be careful doing the knife work. And one thing to keep in mind, and I'm pretty guilty of this, is with your knife, it's very easy to put nicks and scratches into the skull. So actually, if I show you over here on this bison, you look around, you can see, like, here's a spot here where I've made some scratches. You want to be careful about that kind of thing, but you know, it happens. There's another one right there. So the gentler you are, the better the result you're going to get. This one's been banged up a little bit, but I don't really care that much. Right around the base of the horns, you can see I've still got some hair attached there. I want to get all of that off. So I've cleaned it up as best as I could with my knife in the field. But the next step is that hot water approach. Just like when you do a big roast in the crock pot, that hot water is going to soften this connective tissue and make it easy to get off. So what I'm going to do is come over here. I've got some boiling water. I like to use one of these camp stoves outside, but you could do this in your house on your stovetop too, depending on the size of skull that you have. All I'm going to do is just drop this into simmering water. And I want to cover that as best I can. I'm going to show you a little pro tip. Rather than adding more water, which is going to take more fuel to heat, sometimes what I'll do is just drop some stones in there. That'll just displace a little bit more water, bring that water level up a little bit higher without me having to add more fuel and more water to it. I'm going to bring the temperature up. And we're just going to let that cook for a while. I'll flip it back and forth so that all the surfaces get boiled. Funny story about this skull. I was in New Zealand with my team and I had cleaned it pretty well. As you can see, I'd taken most everything off it. And as we went from place to place, I just kept bringing it with me, and it would be in camp with us. And we were staying in a little hunting lodge. And I walked into my room one day and immediately was hit with the smell of like fetid death. And I looked at my producer, Grant, and I said, dude, something in our room smells terrible. I'm looking all around for it. He's like, you think it could be that skull right there with all the meat still attached to it? And it was. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is just let the water work on that for a few minutes, and we'll come back to it. And I'm going to show you the other piece of equipment we're going to need, and that's a pressure washer. I'm using a very low pressure water washer. This one's called the Greenwork 1600. You don't want a real heavy grade commercial duty one because it's just going to destroy the skull. Some parts of the skull that are particularly vulnerable would be like the teeth, where it's really easy to hit so much pressure into that tooth socket that you knock the tooth right out, especially when the skull is still really hot. So we want to be careful of that. So this is made to be very low pressure, and it works great for this purpose. So what we'll do is once all of that tissue is really heated up, I'm going to put that skull right into this crate. That's just so I don't blow it away, right? You can imagine I'm spraying it with the hose and it starts rolling away. So it just kind of holds it in place. And I'm going to clean everything off. And then we'll come back over here where I've got a second container of water heated up. We're going to add some regular 3% hydrogen peroxide like you buy at any pharmacy. And we'll put the skull in there with it. Now that's already starting to work, which is great. Of course, if this still had all of the tissue on it, if it still had all the skin, if it still had eyeballs and all of that, you could do it like that. You can heat all that up. It's going to take longer, but you can actually use the pressure washer to clean all of that skin and hair away. So let's say somebody's come home, let's say you've come home with a deer, and you take the head off. You don't have to do any processing. It could go right into this water. Another thing that I would suggest, though, when it comes time to pressure wash it, I wear my Grundens, my fishing slicks, right? My oil wear, because a lot of skin, a lot of brain material is going to kind of splat back at you. I'm not worried about that today because there's not much on here. This is a pretty clean skull, so I think we're going to get really, really good results. A couple other thoughts I want to go over too is it's not just skulls for trophies. So let me give you an example of another way you could use this technique. This is a moose scapula. And any of you who've moose hunted know that these scapula get used to brush and rake against shrubbery when you're out hunting to kind of mimic the sound of the antlers of a bull moose who's scraping and rubbing. They're also used to sort of mimic the movement of a bull to try to like tease a little aggression out of the bull you're hunting. So on a moose hunt with a friend, this wasn't my moose, this was a friend's moose, but I was there to help. I took a scapula, I used the same technique and cleaned it up, and I put in every year for my main moose tag, and when I finally get it, you know, I'll have this available to me. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a trophy piece. You could use this for a lot of things. You can also use it for a skull that you find. So if you ever find a skull while you're out in the woods and you'd like to take it home and use it, you could use this technique on an old skull as well. Some other things to show you, like I've done, this is a black-tipped shark. And I just love all the little detail in the back there. You can see all of those rows of teeth ready to come in. I just think that's beautiful. Now, remember, a shark does not have real bones. They're all connective tissue, all cartilage. So too much heat and all of that's gonna break down. So I had to go very, very quick, low heat, and mostly just scrape tissue away to reveal this jaw. But I did the same technique with the dipping in the peroxide that we're gonna do, and that worked great. Also, this swordfish bill from season 3 of Wild Fed. So this was last year's show. We harvested this swordfish, and you can see here what that backside looks like. There was quite a lot of tissue in there, so I had to get all of that out. So what we did was cut that bill off up here. We actually suspended it with paracord down into the ocean, let crabs work it for a while, clean it all up, pulled that out. Then I pressure washed it very gently and just scrubbed it down with warm water and peroxide, and that technique worked great here as well. Now when you're seeing bigger skulls, like this alligator here from season 1 of the show, or this bison from season 2 of the show, these were a little more challenging. They're not gonna fit in regular pots. Now this one looks a little dingy. I keep it next to the fireplace, so it's got a lot of dust on it, but in order to do that, what I did is went to like a tractor supply store, an ag supply store, and I bought a feeding trough, a metal feeding trough, which I had to bend into an oval shape to fit that skull in. This was a lot of work because there's a lot of nervous tissue that runs down into the jaw. There's all this crenulation in here. You can see all these little pockets that had to be cleaned out. So this was a very extensive process to clean this skull up, but it's something you can do at home with this same technique. And I'll say for the bison as well, this was just a big skull. I had to drive back from South Carolina with this. From South Dakota with this skull. And what I did was cut that skull, that head off. I sat it on a giant piece of, well actually first, cut it off and put it into a big industrial walk-in freezer. We froze it solid. I sat it on a big piece of styrofoam. I wrapped it with the styrofoam heavy in saran wrap, covered that with wool blankets, wrapped that up, basically built a cooler around it. So I could drive for 3.5 days back to Maine with it, and it stayed frozen the whole time. Once I got home, I did that same thing. I used a big feed tray and set it down in that, boiled it, and did the same technique. So far I haven't found a skull too big to do with this process. Of course they exist, but any of the animals I've been harvesting, I've been able to use this technique for. And again, when you're doing smaller animals, like let me show you this turkey skull here. This was a real delicate project to do, as you can imagine. In fact, in one area here, I had to glue it back together. One of the things I love about this is in the lower jaw, there's still a pellet embedded in there. So that's one of my pieces of heavy shot, that tungsten shot there. And very low heat needed on this. And I didn't pressure wash this skull. This is too small. It would have just broken into pieces. So just delicately using a scraper and a pick and getting in there and cleaning it off. It can be a lot of fun to do a skull like that. I'm just gonna check in on our tar over here. You can see a lot of that material is getting soft already. So if I take that scraper to it, you can see it's ready to start coming up. And so pretty soon we know that pressure washer will take that off. I'm gonna flip it around, let it boil a little bit longer. Now something else I wanted to show you guys, for you bird hunters out there, or those of you who like to hunt birds at times. The reason I've got these feathers out is I want to show another aspect of doing this kind of natural mount. What I've found is for years, I would try to take turkey fans and preserve them whole. I like the way they look a lot. What I found though is I would always end up with this kind of material at the bottom. So I would, clean them up as best I could. And the problem is if you take all of the tissue off, then the feathers simply fall out. The whole thing falls apart. So you've got to leave some on there. But what I'll end up finding is those carnivorous beetles that taxidermists are using. I'll find those guys running around my house because they're over here eating this and they're leaving their discard all around. It gets really messy. So what I do now is I'll use a fan like this to hunt with. So if I'm going to use this for reaping, if I'm going to hide behind it while I hunt, then I'll keep it preserved like this. But if I actually want to display it, I've taken to doing something different. And that is really cleaning the feathers up so there's no tissue left on them. And I'll do something like this. This is my wife Ivani's first turkey. So that came from season 3 of the show when she did her first turkey hunt. And I just used a nice little vase to display it. There's another turkey that we displayed that way. In season 4 of the show, we harvest the peacock. Here's just some of the smaller feathers. I have a couple of vases like this, some much larger, but you can see this is a really nice way to display a bird without having to have that kind of meat material still attached to it. So these are just some creative ways that you can put your animals out as memories, but not have to think about the hygienic component of it. Because again, I think a lot of this stuff can be a lot of maintenance if you're having to constantly vacuum taxidermies or keep all of the insect debris cleaned up because they're eating away at the base of your tail fan. So, of course, peacock's a bit exotic, but you could imagine the feathers of a pheasant or any other bird that you harvest, ducks with really beautiful plumage, displayed like this could be a really nice way to do it. So what I'm trying to show you here is that there's a real natural way you can do this without needing a lot of equipment. And also, like I mentioned before, if you've ever brought a skull or a hide into the taxidermist, it's not just expensive, and it is expensive, of course, but it's a lot of wait time. So you're separated from that skull for a really long time. And I like the idea that I can get this done real quick at home. And whenever I see it, I know that's the work that I've done. One thing I really want to suggest that you do not do, that's leave the skull outside. So I've got friends who have taken their bison skulls and left them outside to try to let sort of weather and critters clean it up for them. And they'll end up with an okay skull, but those horns will get really, really light in color. They'll crack and split. They start to slide off so that they're not actually attached anymore. And so I've got friends who've come over and seen this and been like, wow, how did you do that skull? And it's this method that worked really good for me. So again, another reason that I recommend it. All right, let's check back in with our skull, see how it's doing. And I think that we're getting pretty close now to where we can at least do our first round. Stuff is starting to scrape up pretty nice now. It's a bit of a balancing act. If I leave it in there too long, remember that a skull has, you can really see it on this bison here, these are called sutures. So the skull is actually made of quite a few bones, and they're sutured together. And those sutures will start to soften the longer you boil. Remember, it is connective tissue that's holding those sutures together. So if we get in there with too much hot water and separate those, eventually the skull's gonna come apart. If we don't boil it long enough, we're not gonna soften the stuff up we're trying to get off of there. So we wanna find that right balance. This can go longer, but I don't want it to go too long, and I definitely don't want it to go so long that the horns start coming off. Oh, and that reminds me, something else I'd like to show you is antlers. A lot of folks are worried that if they do this technique, the antlers are gonna bleach, and I brought this buck out to show you. Now, this isn't a real impressive buck, but this is the first buck I took off this piece of property, so it's an important memory for me. And so again, if it was a big impressive buck, maybe I'd want to take it for a full mount, a taxidermy mount. But it's not that impressive of a buck. It's just an important buck to me. So I wanted to preserve it. This technique worked great. And as you can see, we didn't have to worry about these antlers getting bleached. They've maintained their color. But if you look at this buck just behind, this I call my ghost buck, these antlers are pure white, and that's because they were in velvet. So something I had wondered is what would happen if I took a pressure washer to that velvet material on a young buck. This buck was harvested in late summer. Well, as long as the antlers are fully formed, and as you can see, these ones were, they'd actually come to point. So sometimes you know how those antlers will be. They'll just be knobs on the end because they're still haven't differentiated into individual tines. If you clean that off, well, then you're going to have those knobs, of course. But this buck had actually fully formed, and he was just getting ready to start scraping that velvet away. And so when I took the pressure washer to it, it cleaned them up, and these antlers hadn't fully ossified or turned fully to bone. So they were still white underneath and hadn't been exposed to the elements, and it made for an all-white skull. And this is just a real prize skull to me. I really like the way this one looks. So know that you don't have to worry about this process damaging the antlers. It won't. But if you do have a velvet buck, be gentle and careful with that pressure washer because the ends are still very soft and we don't want to break those away. All right, this has been boiling for a few minutes, and I think what we should do, bring it over and we'll just test that pressure washer out and see if it's ready to start removing any of this material. So I'm going to place it down in here, and the reason is I just don't want this to get blown away by the pressure from the hose. And I'm just going to see if I can peel some of that material off. If you look, you can see what's happening here. This is all starting to come away. So it is working just great, but it could probably use a little more boiling time. So I'll just clean up what I can right now, and then we'll stick it back in that hot water and let it keep going. Now, if you look inside the foramen magnum here, you can just see there's a bit of a membrane in there, and I'm going to have to fish that out of there. That is actually the meninges that held the brain intact before. So I'll bring this over to the table. We'll get this boiling again, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So as I mentioned, this is just going to need a little bit more time. Get all the stones out of there. Again, if you were doing this and the brains were still in there, you'd want to be very careful about how those brains are made out of pure fat, and they will spray out and get all over you. So you want to be careful. All right, there we go. See that? You can actually see, now this is shrunk up and shriveled. So this is like the jerky form of it, but you can see the crenulations of the brain there. Isn't that cool? So that's the sac that the brain is contained in, called the meninges. So meningitis, that's when this sac around your brain becomes inflamed. That's what meningitis is. So these meninges protect the brain. And now that we've got that out, we know that that skull case is nice and clean inside. So I would plan, if you were going to do this with a fresh skull, I would give yourself a couple of hours. This is going to be not a short task, but it is something you can get done, like I said, same day. So if you came back from a morning hunt with an animal, you could theoretically have that animal done, or that skull done that same day. But know you're going to be putting some hours in. If you decide to do this in the house, know that you're going to have a lot of steam. So if you have wallpaper, you know, be mindful of that. Vent the house a little bit, because that steam is going to want to steam up your windows and really accumulate in the house if you're doing this for a long time. And then, of course, I would recommend bringing it outside, especially if you live with somebody else. That'd be a lot to explain. And I can't overemphasize the mess that the brain will make. So again, you can get that entire brain out of the head with just the pressure washer, but that means focusing that nozzle into that opening at the base of the skull, the foramen magnum. And when you do that, brain is coming back out at you. So wear your Gore-Tex or something that's easy to wash. Whatever clothes you have will probably get ruined in that process. So just be mindful of that. For us, we kind of think of it as, you know, we've got a lot of skulls in our kitchen and in our living room, which are connected rooms. And when we're eating an animal, I like to be able to look up and see that animal's skull there in the room with us. So sometimes I'll sit down, I'll have just cooked, and Avani will say to me, like, who are we eating today? And I'll be able to like point, oh, it's him right there, or it's her over there. And we think of it as a position of honor in our house. So it's a way for us to honor that animal. And I think there's just something really cool about being able to be looked upon by that skull while you eat that animal. There's been many times working on episodes of Wild Fed where my producer Grant and I will be sitting there making the episode, and the animal we're watching on the screen's skull is right there with us. And again, we're not doing that to be morbid. To us, it's a way of honoring that animal a little bit more. This season of the show was so cool because we were able to harvest this tar, but also, and that was in New Zealand, where we also harvested the peacock whose feathers you saw over there. So some cool trophies that came home with us. Tonight's episode is gooey duck, and I actually kept some of the shells from that. So if you've seen any of those promos running, or you know what a gooey duck is, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, get ready for one of the most lewd and inappropriate looking animals you've ever seen. If it wasn't for the fact that this is pure zoology, I would be embarrassed to post images of this thing because it is the most phallic looking clam you've ever seen. But I'll often do things like that too. I'll keep clamshells, I'll keep fish scales, all kinds of things like that that remind me of the hunt that I've been on or the time that I've spent. All right, we're gonna try to hit this with a little more water, see what we can get done. Okay, at this point, what I'm doing is I'm looking for areas where there's still good amounts of tissue hanging on, like that right around this eye socket. And so I'm going to put a little extra focus on that spot. Okay. Now, we've got some more that needs to come off of here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to show you guys, we're starting to get some rain here. So I'm going to take this to the final piece, and I'll just show you how I whiten it. Once we get done this video, I'm going to go back and actually work this a little bit more. But just before this rain starts pouring too heavy, I'll show you this last step. So I'm going to put a few of those stones in here just to add a little bit of volume. So this water comes up a little bit higher. See if I can fit one more in there. There we go. Now this water doesn't have to boil. It just needs to be, close to a simmer, nice and hot. And I'm going to take a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. This is just regular 3%. You don't need the strong stuff. You'll see guys on the online saying you need to go to a salon and get the stuff used for bleaching hair or the powder stuff. I haven't found that. This works fantastic for me and starts bleaching right away. And you'll actually be able to see that happening very quickly.
Daniel, Allison Dukes wants to know if you have the pressure washer on the lowest pressure.
So that pressure washer isn't very adjustable. It's just 1600 PSI only. But if I was, yes. And in fact, if I only had like a commercial grade pressure washer and I was worried it was going to be too strong, I might actually get one of those pressure washer attachments that goes on the end of a regular garden hose. Maybe just try that first, because lower pressure is better. Again, high pressure is going to blow the teeth right out of the sockets or put a hole in the skull. Now you can see in some of these areas how quickly that's starting to whiten up. And that's just 3% hydrogen peroxide from the regular pharmacy. Now once I take it out of that water that I did the original boil in, I'm not going to reuse that water. So if you want to use one pot for this whole thing, you'd empty that out, because remember, that's like almost a stock now. Look at that. That's like soup.
Head soup.
That's head soup. So we don't want to reuse that. We pour that out, fill it with fresh water, heat it up, and then add the peroxide. But for the sake of doing this quickly, I've brought just two out here. And again, you're seeing how quickly that's starting to whiten up, particularly in here. But I've got a lot of cleanup that still needs to happen. We haven't had enough time. See, some of this material is still ready to come off, but it's very close. So when we end this video, I'll go back and do another wash on it, take the rest of that material off. But what I tend to do next, once I get that all cleaned up and it's looking how I want it, I'll usually just take a piece of cord, tie it through the back of the skull like this, so that I can put a nail in the wall and mount it just like that. So that's how I do all of my mounts at home. It's a very easy way to do it. It's very fast. It's super inexpensive, right? That peroxide probably costs $1, whatever fuel I need to heat this up. So this is something you can do at home, cheap and easy. I hope you give it a try, and I hope you check out season 4 of Wildfed. We premiered tonight with our Gooey Duck episode, and we'll be running every Monday, 7:30 p.m. East, for the next 10 weeks on Outdoor Channel. And if you don't have cable, tune into Friendly, FRNDLY.com. They mirror all of the broadcasts at Outdoor Channel, so you can watch it online streaming live as it airs at friendlytv.com as well. Otherwise, tune into Outdoor Channel, and we'll see you soon.